You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now back with our conversation with University of Minnesota political science professor Kathryn Pearson and the surprising caucus results in the Minneapolis DFL City Council races. The Minneapolis City Council is up for re-election this November. New district lines have been drawn, and there's been a good amount of political drama so far revolving around the City Council candidate selections. 4 incumbents on the DFL side have actually not been given the endorsements by the party. Is this council shakeup, if you will, due to the new redistricting, or are voters clamoring for issues current council members have been ignoring?
I think it's some combination of both. We saw a wave of city council upsets in 2001, and so sometimes there are movements for change. But one of the interesting things about city council races is we think about elections and the incumbency advantage and how incumbents usually have such a head start over their opponents. And that is true in the case of city council candidates as well. But one of the complicating factors is the DFL endorsement process. And in a room of 200, 300, 400 delegates, it's a lot easier to unseat an incumbent than it would be actually in a general election. Now, some of these incumbents have said they would abide by the DFL endorsement. It's unclear how many will, but what happens is a new candidate, even when facing an incumbent, has the ability to rally new supporters to the caucuses, to the ward conventions, and have an upset with a lot of work mobilizing, but at a relatively low cost financially. And so these incumbency advantages that we see in the polls in general elections, it can be destabilized when it comes to the caucus endorsement process. And with an exciting candidate who can rally new people to the caucuses and conventions, those make the conditions ripe for upsets, and I think that's a lot of what we've seen.
In the upcoming November election, Minneapolis voters will experience ranked choice voting for the first time. In this situation, is it more or less important for a candidate to get the DFL nomination, both for the city council and for the mayoral race?
Well, with these city council contests, we've seen a lot of contests with only a couple of candidates, and so with only 2 candidates or even 3 candidates, the ranked choice voting becomes, I think, less significant. But in the mayoral race, I think ranked choice voting has really changed the dynamics of this race. The candidates are, most of the candidates actually have said that they won't necessarily abide by the DFL endorsement. Councilmember Gary Schiff is the only candidate who's actually said at this point that he will abide by the DFL endorsement, but I think it's likely that even he is counting on no endorsement coming out of a convention. Because even though delegates like to see an endorsement after they've spent their day, their Saturday in a convention, with ranked choice voting, it's just very unlikely that there will be one, and frankly, delegates have less of an incentive to decide amongst themselves who the endorsed candidate should be. It's highly unlikely that anyone other than a DFL candidate will win in November. And so I think the logic with ranked choice voting of letting all of the voters decide is a pretty compelling one.
Have the Republicans essentially given up on Minneapolis? I believe the last Republican member of the city council was Dennis Scholstedt many years ago. Have they ceded this territory to the DFL?
Well, certainly if you look at election results, Minneapolis is a DFL stronghold. That said, there is one independent candidate running, Cam Whitten, who identifies himself as a Republican but is running as an independent. And I suspect he will attract some support, not just from Republicans, but from some independents and even weak DFLers as well. But I think in general, it is very difficult for a Republican to win in Minneapolis unless they are very, very moderate and really have a compelling issue or personal profile, and even then, it's an uphill battle.
From a political science perspective, does the ranked choice voting system make it harder to predict election outcomes?
Well, I think first and foremost, the lack of good polling in an election like this makes it hard to predict. You know, the supporters, elite supporters, sort of party activist supporters, that tells us something. What the candidates say in terms of their fundraising, that tells us something. Delegate counts at a convention will tell us something. But one of the things that actually is, I think, a little bit troubling to political scientists when it comes to ranked choice voting is knowing how many voters will be dissuaded from voting at all because they don't want to learn a new complicated system, and knowing how many spoiled ballots there will be. Now, the past local elections, we haven't seen a ton of spoiled ballots. But what's more difficult to discern is if there are voters who are staying home because they just don't want to deal with learning a new system. And again, it's hard to know, even from a political science research perspective, the extent to which that is happening. But that is one thing, at least that possibility is one thing that I worry about as a political scientist in terms of people coming to the polls and actually casting a legitimate vote.
What do you think is important for voters to be aware of with ranked choice voting?
I think really just how the system works, that this is the system that, unlike federal elections where they're just choosing one candidate, that in fact they are choosing 3 candidates and ranking them in order, and really making sure that they do this right, seeing ballots in advance so that they don't spoil their ballot and that they're not intimidated by doing this. I know for regular politicians it's sort of hard, and regular voters it's hard to imagine, how could this be intimidating, but for a lot of people, voting is not, politics is not something that they're very focused on, and turnout in off-cycle elections like this one is often, much, much, much lower. But with an open mayoral seat, turnout is important. And so I think that, ensuring that people who are not paying a lot of attention to politics, who don't necessarily know about this different voting system in this local election as compared to federal elections, that they're aware of the changes and aren't dissuaded or spoil their ballot as a result.
Kathryn Pearson is an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Professor Pearson, thanks so much for joining us again on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. Coming up next month, the conversation with University of Minnesota President Eric Kaler. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.